Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Today's webinar is being recorded and the recording will be posted publicly. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Now, I'd like to turn the call over to your host, Ms. Tanja White. Tanja, you may begin.
Thank you, Greg, for hosting our webinar. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the April Local Employment Dynamics, or LED, webinar. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the LED Partnership in collaboration with the Council for Community and Economic Research and the Labor Market Information Institute, it is my pleasure to welcome a past presenter of the LED workshop and Longitudinal Employment Housing Dynamics, or LEHD, staff member, Kevin McKinney, as he presents U.S. earnings dynamics, inequality, mobility, and volatility. Using data from the U.S. Census Bureau's LEHD infrastructure files, McKinney addresses changes over time and across subnational populations in the distribution of real labor earnings. He analyzes four large metropolitan areas, statistical areas, or MSAs, Detroit, Los Angeles, New York, and San Francisco, for a time period 1998 to 2017, with particular attention paid to subperiods before, during, and after the Great Recession. For the four large MSAs analyzed, there were clear national trends represented in each of the local areas. The most prominent of them, which is the increase in the share of earnings accruing to workers at the top of the earnings distribution in 2017 compared with 1998. However, the magnitude of these trends varies across MSAs, with New York and San Francisco showing relatively large increases, and Los Angeles somewhere in the middle relative to Detroit, whose total earnings distributions is relatively stable over the time period. Kevin McKinney joined LEHD in 1999 as part of the initial group of economists hired to develop what is now called the Quarterly Workforce Indicators. He has worked on the Employer Characteristics File, the National Identification Characteristics File, and disclosure avoidance for a variety of LEHD products. Kevin received a BA in economics from the University of California, Irvine in 1998 and a PhD in economics from the University of California, Santa Barbara in 2000. His research interests are in immigration, human capital, and workers' earnings mobility. Thank you for joining us, Kevin.
Great. Thank you for the nice introduction, Tanja. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, possibly even good evening. Today, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about U.S. earnings dynamics. Any views I express in this presentation are my own. They're not the official views of the Census Bureau or any other research sponsor. And first of all, let's start with some background here. In 2014, John Aboud and I began a multiple year effort to sort of better understand the dispersion and dynamics of worker earnings in the United States. And today we're going to focus on three measures that capture sort of different features of a worker's earnings history. The first of those is inequality, and that's the dispersion of worker earnings at a point in time, typically annual. Volatility, the dispersion in the change in worker earnings over time, typically short duration, year-to-year changes. And then mobility, which is a longer change in a worker's earnings over time, often with multiple year earnings measures as well. Okay, so just to get us sort of oriented in sort of what we're talking about here, here's two simulated earnings histories that show worker one in the blue line, worker two in the green line, and then the average of worker one in the red and the average of worker two in the purple. And worker one sort of has maybe a stylized earnings history that you might be used to seeing. The worker starts at around $50,000 in 1998, and then their earnings increased to around $63,000 in 2000, I have the check covering this here, 2007. And then worker two has substantially lower earnings, and those earnings actually vary quite a bit over time with a small upward trend, and also importantly, a zero earnings year in 1999. And these zero earnings years actually play a prominent role in inequality. We're going to highlight some of that in the talk today, but there's still work to do in that area for the future. And so inequality would be, if we take year 2000 here, would be the difference in earnings for the worker between worker one and worker two in that year. Of course, we're going to have a lot more workers in our analysis sample, but it's the spread or dispersion in those earnings that we're talking about with inequality. A volatility would be the dispersion of the change in earnings. So if you think about the percentage change in earnings between 2001 and 2002, worker two has a substantially larger percentage change in earnings than, for example, worker one, even though the absolute difference in earnings might actually be larger for worker one. I don't think it is in this case, but it could be. And then mobility would be sort of this longer term trend, the long line that you see there. How are earnings changing over 5, 10, even 10 years? We're going to show shorter duration mobility changes, but the concept is still the same here. Okay? And so we're hoping to sort of summarize these changes using LEHD job level earnings data. And job level earnings data is great in LEHD. It covers a broad universe or population of workers. It's dense, a very dense sample. We receive almost all the earnings in the private sector, and there's a relatively long time series. However, in order to properly measure a person level statistic like inequality, volatility, and mobility, we need a consistent longitudinal person identifier. And in our research, we discovered early on that measured earnings inequality differs substantially for sort of all jobs and all workers as compared to all eligible workers. And so just to get a sense of the difference that the sample selection can make when looking at earnings inequality, here's some results from one of our first papers looking at the time series of earnings inequality. And we're going to measure earnings inequality by the differences between various percentiles. So for example, the ratio of the P99 to the P1, the P90 to the P10, and so on. And also the variance of log earnings is on here as well. And you can see this downward trend in earnings inequality up to year 2000. And then after that, it's relatively flat if we use all jobs and all workers. However, if we look at only eligible workers, which I'll define in just a minute more clearly, the trend changes substantially. Now, post-2000, we actually have earnings inequality increasing for all the measures. In the previous graph, it was really only the P99 to P1, so the very extreme tails of the distribution where you saw this increase in inequality, whereas now it's a much more broad-based change in inequality. Almost any measure you use will show that increase up to 2013 here. And so what do I mean by sort of an eligible worker here? Well, the problem we're trying to deal with is that post-year 2000, LEHD has a relatively large number of jobs, anywhere from, I think, 6 to 17 million. I can't see that last number every year, but it varies by time. They'd either have an invalid SSN associated with the job, an implausible age, or a large number of employers. And so some workers are assigned too many jobs and others receive too few jobs, which ends up biasing sort of the trends in inequality that we estimate. And so we want to get a sample where we can reliably assign jobs to a particular worker and that the worker uses that person identifier consistently over time. And so our eligible worker sample is going to use only jobs associated with a worker that has a valid Social Security number. We're only going to use jobs when that SSN is active, has been issued, and the worker is not reported dead, so that another worker can't use that number sort of before it's been issued, and also that they can't use it after the worker is reported dead. Also, we're going to limit earnings analysis to workers in sort of a reasonable age range, because we do see SSNs that are used for very young workers and very old workers when they're actually, the person that SSN was issued to is actually very unlikely to be active in the labor market. And then we're also going to limit our worker sample to those that have more than 12 active jobs during the, or sorry, that have less than 12 active jobs during the year. And so this sort of prevents this multiple persons using the same identifier where you get too many jobs assigned to a given person, at least in the analysis data set. Okay, and we saw before, if you do those restrictions, it makes a very material difference on the earnings inequality results. And so those jobs are entering in a specific part of the earnings distribution that sort of biases those measures when you include these workers or don't include them. So here's another set of national estimates, more recent, looking up to 2019. It's the sum of our annual earnings at all jobs. Annual earnings must be greater than 1,500 in this example. We also do other results where we don't have this minimum earnings restriction. We have 22 years in the next results. And just a quick aside before we take a look at the earnings inequality. One interesting result is that if you look at longer durations of earnings, for example, instead of annual, look at 3-year or 5-year, even longer averages. As you do that, earnings inequality actually gets larger. And part of that is that the reason for that is that when we do longer earnings measures, we can include 0 earnings years in the analysis. And these 0 earnings years aren't randomly allocated. So workers at the bottom of the earnings distribution are much more likely to have a 0 earnings year than workers at the top of the earnings distribution. And this spreads out or increases the earnings inequality. And just something to keep in mind. We're going to try and take advantage of that in some of our future work, which we have recently as well in one of our more recent papers, taking a look at earnings differences across racial groups. So here's sorry, I'm going to move my camera here down so I can actually see all my slides. There we go. That's great. And so in the top row, we have males and females, and we have the percentiles of the earnings distribution starting in 1998 and going to 2019. And this shows the relative change in the percentiles over time. So the P90 is the blue dotted line, and we can see that the 90th percentile for males increased about 23% over the 22-year period. And then you can look at the other percentiles as you sort of move down. Their growth is generally is smaller over this time period. And so if you were thinking about inequality and you wanted to, for example, compare the P90 to the P10, that's one of the measures that we showed earlier, you can see that the P10, the 10th percentile, had a very different trajectory over the period. There was a steep drop in the 10th percentile after the recession in 2001. The vertical gray bars are recessions. And then in 2009 as well, there was another steep drop, but then a very strong recovery post-Great Recession. If you contrast that with workers at the middle of the earnings distribution, P50, they didn't face near the drop in earnings over the first part of the period that the 10th percentile workers did, but the recovery also wasn't quite as strong either. So this is going to play a role in sort of earnings inequality here. And that gap between the P90 and P10 is the earnings inequality measure that we're talking about. And so you can see that earnings inequality grows. It sort of reaches its peak at 2009 and then declines slowly as you move towards 2019. Females look a bit different. You see the increases in the percentiles at the top. They're generally greater than those at the bottom, but the sort of spread between the P90 and P10 isn't as large as it is for males. And you also didn't see the large drop in earnings in the P10 for females that you see for males. And that's a pretty standard result that's been confirmed by other researchers looking at various other labor market data sources as well. And so females generally at the bottom of the distribution failed a bit better than males did over this period. And then the bottom row sort of shows the very top of the earnings distribution. Generally, as you move up to the extremely high quantiles like the P99.99, earnings get extremely variable, but for males at least, they generally track each other in terms of trends fairly well. Females, a bit different, especially at the P99.99. And so if we look at the P90 to P10 measure explicitly, you can see that rise we saw in the previous graph and then the slow decline. And sort of what's sort of driving this decline in inequality in the post-Great Recession period for both males and females? Well, it's the strong growth in earnings for workers at the bottom of the earnings distribution. So if you look in the bottom row, you can see the P50 to P10, and that ratio is actually declining. So workers at the bottom are actually getting a bit closer to workers in the middle, whereas you still have this rise in earnings inequality for the top relative to the middle going on. And that's the blue line that's increasing pretty much consistently over the period. Okay, so that's the national trends, but we want to use LEHD data here to sort of take advantage of the dense nature of the data to see what communities or MSAs are doing and how they differ from the national average and from the national statistics and from each other. And so some of the MSAs are going to be following national trends, others are going to differ. And we want to be able to decompose this national change into components due to the various MSAs or local areas. We're going to use a largely non-parametric approach, and let's take a look and see. So we have a little bit more. We're trying to get national coverage. We did these first four large MSAs initially for disclosure purposes, partly because the large sample sizes allowed us to release the results as opposed to for some of the smaller areas, which we're still working on disclosure methods for those. We eventually would like to have an interactive access to these statistics. LAHD has a successful history of developing this type of product, QWI Explorer, On the Map, and J2J, for example. And one inspiration for our work as well, if you haven't taken a look at it, you might want to, there's this Equality of Opportunity project that Raj Chetty collaborated with the Census Bureau on, and it looks at intergenerational mobility. So for example, parents in a given neighborhood at the bottom of the earnings distribution, where do their children end up in their future earnings when they're also adults? And that's another interesting project. And we'd like to be able to do something here. So take a look at the geospatial variability and earnings inequality across the United States. So behind all of these inequality measures, are earnings distributions. And we could potentially release some of the parametric measures of earnings inequality that the Census Bureau releases already, but we want to provide additional detail and actually show the underlying earnings distributions that drive these inequality statistics. And there's two earnings distributions that we're going to be taking a look at today. And we're going to do that by creating histograms of the earnings distributions. And we're going to divide the support of the earnings distribution into various bins. 5 for mobility results, which we'll see later, and then 25 for inequality bins, for inequality. And then we're going to create 2 sums in each of the bins. The sum of workers in each bin, and then the sum of total earnings in each bin. And it's both of these that drive earnings inequality. So earnings inequality is relatively high when there's a lot of dispersion, or the workers are spread out in the different earnings bins. And also as the average earnings or the total earnings in each of the bins varies, that drives inequality as well. And so having access to both, which you will have, we're going to show just the total earnings results today, allows you to better interpret the changes that are happening in a local area. Okay, and so here's a coarse version of our earnings distribution. We're going to show the 25 bin results next, but just to sort of get yourself oriented and to show how our urban areas compare to the national average, here's the employment histogram with 5 bins. And so the US average is the first blue bar on the left, and then the metro areas are arrayed out to the right. And so if we start at the top earnings bin, the 132,000 plus, you can see San Francisco on the far right. A bit over 10% of workers in San Francisco earn more than $132,000. New York's a bit less, and then LA, and then Detroit. And you can see that trend sort of in the top 2 bins, even the top 3 bins, and then it sort of flips to there's relatively more workers in the bottom bins in Detroit and LA. And this is a zero-sum game. So earnings localities that have a large share of relatively high earning workers are typically going to have a relatively low share of low earning workers. Okay. And one other thing to take a look at, you can see here that there's fewer higher earning workers in New York, but when we go to the total earnings distribution, the share of total earnings in the top bin is actually about the same. And that's because the average earnings in New York for these high earning workers is actually higher than it is in San Francisco. Okay. And then you can see sort of the stylized result that that you see in most earnings distribution, the largest share of earnings accrues to workers at the top of the earnings distribution. So almost 45% in New York and San Francisco of earnings are attributable to workers with income or earnings above 132,000. And also, if you look at employment, there's about 35% of the workers in the bottom bin, but they only represent, at the national average, about 5% of total earnings. So their average earnings are very low. Okay, so we're going to show some of the single number measures of earnings inequality. The Gini coefficient is sort of the long historical measure of earnings inequality. A lot of people use percentile-based measures, which we've shown already. Earnings share measures are also another. So the share of earnings attributable to the top 20% of workers relative to the bottom 20%. But each of these measures places a slightly different weight or importance on different parts of the earnings or total earnings distribution. And they can also mask large changes in the underlying earnings distribution that are occurring while inequality is relatively stable. And we're going to see an example of that for San Francisco shortly. And so here's what the Gini coefficients look like for the 4 metro areas. We have New York at the top. It has the highest earnings inequality. Then Los Angeles, arguably San Francisco, and finally Detroit. And if you look at there's variation over the years, but you can see New York has a general increase, LA less so, San Francisco a bit as well, and then Detroit has maybe a small decline in inequality from 1998 to 2017. So if we take a look at a different measure, the ratio of the earnings shares of the top 20 to the bottom 20%, you get a slightly different result. Generally, the ordering's about the same, but there's a much larger drop in earnings inequality, for example, for Detroit than there is in the Gini-based measure, especially in that post-Great Recession period. So, but overall, sort of in agreement, but there are differences between these two measures in terms of the change in earnings inequality that we estimate. Okay. And so here's the total earnings distribution for Detroit and Los Angeles. We're going to take a look at New York and San Francisco in a bit. And this is what the total earnings distribution looks like in 1998. And so the total earnings distribution shows the share of earnings attributable to workers in a given earnings range. So for example, that large tail to the right, if you maybe at 160, 170,000, if you took the area under that curve up to 300,000, that would give you the share of earnings attributed to workers at the top of the earnings distribution. And it's relatively large precisely because they're high earning workers. Detroit and Los Angeles don't look too different. Los Angeles has a bit more of earnings allocated to low earnings workers, whereas Detroit has sort of this bigger upper middle region, which is Detroit's the blue line and LA's the red line. And LA has a slightly larger amount, share of workers of earnings allocated to high earning workers. Okay, here's what it looks like in 2017. So here's 1998, and then here's 2017. So they look perhaps a bit more different. Both areas have had an increase in earnings at the top, LA perhaps a bit more, but there's also been a decrease in the share of earnings going to the bottom. And that's going to, in most cases, end up mitigating some of what we would think would be a rise in earnings inequality if everything stayed the same and the top just increased. And so here's Detroit. Over the whole period, we're going to take a look at this and see which time periods from 1998 to 2017 did most of the change occur. Now, Detroit's not the metro area that had the largest change, but there is going to be a certain time period that is actually relatively more important. So if we look at 1998 to 2007, you can see this sort of shift to the right here. And you can see the share of earnings decreasing for bottom earnings workers and increasing for those in the upper middle. But there's no real change at the very top in this period. Then 2007 to 2011, there's sort of a regression back. There is this increase at the top, but there's also an increase in the share of earnings in workers at the bottom. And that's going to increase inequality, which we saw in the previous in the previous slides with the Gini coefficient and so on. And then here's 2011 to 2017, not a huge change as well, but there is that sort of decrease in the share of earnings going to workers at the bottom of the earnings distribution, and some in the upper middle and a bit of a decrease in the middle. And so then here's the net change overall. And so actually overall earnings inequality, according to the share measure, actually declined over the period. And that's partly because even though there's these increases in the share of earnings going at the top, there's also this corresponding decrease in the share of earnings going to the bottom. And here, the results are sort of roughly consistent. But when we get to New York and San Francisco, whose earnings distributions look substantially different and have a much larger dramatic change over the period. So here's New York and San Francisco in 1998, not too different. And here they are in 2017. And so you can see sort of the dramatic changes in the earnings distribution over the period, a huge increase in the share of earnings going to workers at the top and a big decrease in the share of earnings going to workers in the middle, bottom and middle of the earnings distribution. And so let's take a look at San Francisco from 1998 to 2017. Here's sort of how the earnings distribution changed. You see what we saw in the previous slide. Here's this 1998 to 2007, the shifts going on pretty strongly during this period. The Great Recession, actually earning inequality probably increases a bit because of this increase in the share of earnings allocated to low earning workers. And then you have a strong return to earnings growth at the top and the decreases at the bottom. And so this is a big change in the total earnings distribution for San Francisco. But if you looked at the earnings inequality measures that we showed before, you wouldn't have seen there's an increase in inequality, but it's not as dramatic as the reallocation in earnings that you see here. And that's largely because of this shift to the top occurring at the same time as there's a shift out of the bottom, sort of canceling out the effects at the top to a large extent. Okay, so we had inequality increases for all areas. Most of the earnings distributions are relatively stable during the Great Recession. It doesn't include, so this inequality statistic doesn't include zero earnings workers. And we have some work that we've looked at for zero earning workers, because the Great Recession did have a huge number of workers that exited the labor market for a long period of time. The effect of that is not included in these earnings inequality measures, but it is something we want to include in a web application or in our future statistics. Okay. And so we want to allow sort of people to compare MSA earnings and total earnings distributions with different reference distributions, either the same metro area over time as we showed before, or comparisons with other metro areas, or even the national average. Allow users to highlight areas above and below the reference, and also allow for interactive cut points, so you can focus on certain parts of the earnings distribution, and then the earnings inequality statistics would potentially recalculate for whatever part of the earnings distribution that you're focused on. And so if you wanted to lessen the impact of lower earning workers, you could exclude them from the analysis and see how inequality measures changed. And so hopefully that will allow users to sort of get a better understanding of how inequality is changing, as well as the earnings distribution itself, which could potentially have big welfare impacts for the workers, because it does matter whether are those workers at the bottom moving up? Is that why the distribution shifted to the right? Or are they leaving that metro area and new workers are coming in that are higher earning workers? And you can understand that by having the earnings distribution and some of the other mobility statistics that we've done as well. Okay, and so the next topic is taking a look at earnings mobility. And earnings mobility is the transition of a worker from sort of one part of the earnings distribution in a given period to a different part of the earnings distribution in the next period, or T plus G as I call it. A subsequent, you can have a gap bigger than one. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the adjacent year. And that's if we want to look at sort of longer term earnings mobility. In the results that we show here, the gap, or G, is only one. We're going to look at shocks that occur between 2008 and 2009, but we're also going to follow those workers for 3 additional years. So we get a longer term picture of, given that their earnings changed or didn't change, how did their earnings history on average look after the 2008-2009 period. We're going to use the smaller subset of earnings bins. There's going to be 7. That gives 49 possible transitions. We have to add, which we'll show in the next slide here. One other thing I should mention before I go on, the location of the worker in all our results here is determined by where they work, not by where they live. And so in order to know where a worker is at, they need to have a job in their recent job history. So an adjacent year has to be an employed year. If they haven't worked for 2 years, then they drop out of the analysis sample in all of our results. We could potentially do residence-based statistics, but that's still an active sort of area of development within LAHD. It is used, but we haven't done it that way, at least currently. And yes, someone asked the question, these are all real earnings, not nominal earnings. So these are all real earnings changes. Earnings are allocated to one of 7 bins. We have this bin 0, that's the inactive, and then adjacent year active. Then you have the 5 earnings bins you see here. And then bin 6 is active in another MSA. So when you do national level statistics, you don't have to worry about the mobility of workers within the US. But once you go to an MSA level, we're going to actually track workers that are entering from another MSA and leaving to another MSA. Okay. And so we're going to group these transitions. There's 45 eligible transitions. That's a large number to analyze. And so we're going to group them together based on their patterns. And so an entrant to the analysis MSA is 0-1, that's an E. An exit from analysis is a 1-0. You can see earnings up, earnings down, and there are all these two-digit numbers that represent their bin in T and then their bin in T+1. And this is what the mobility transition matrix looks like. You can see the stayers, the workers that are in the same earnings bin in the 2 years. They're on the main diagonal. The upper off diagonals, those are workers that have their earnings go up. The corresponding one, the workers go down. And then you can see the X, E, M's, and L's on sort of the edges of the matrix here. And this is what we're trying to capture. We're trying to capture, you can see the distribution of the bins on the left, the current year bin T represented by the various colors. There's a new distribution in T+1, and that distribution changed because largely of the movement of workers from one bin to another bin. And so, for example, some workers stay in the same bin, some move up, and some move down. And so here's earnings mobility for entrants. So these are new entrants to the analysis. They've been out of the labor force for at least 2 years. Some will be new entrants, they'll be young workers, and some will be workers that had an extended absence from the labor market. And so these new entrants, there's a pie chart in the upper left that shows the share of the workers of a given transition type. So 0-1 would be workers that had 0 earnings in 2008. They appeared in San Francisco in 2009, and their earnings were in the bottom earnings bin. And so most of the entrants, when they enter the labor market in San Francisco, they have relatively low earnings, and they make up about over 75% of this type of entrants. You can see their earning growth over the subsequent 3 years in 2010, 2011, and 2012. And then you can see that earnings growth is a bit higher for workers at the top, which would exacerbate earnings inequality, but that's not going to hold as we go along. You'll see that the growth for workers that actually move up to the top is going to decline as we look at different earnings patterns. And so here's bin 1. These are workers that had earnings in 2008 at the bottom of the earnings distribution from $1,000 to $18,000 real earnings. In 2009, they had various outcomes. And so the red line would be workers that didn't work at all in 2009, and then you can see their earnings growth. in 2010, 2011, and 12, and it's actually fairly strong. Some of that is probably due to the fact that they may have left their job in 2008 and had a higher earnings job in 2008 than in 2007, for example, than we might have thought, because they've been out of the work for a fairly long period of time. But interestingly enough, compared to workers that are at the bottom of the earnings distribution for both years, their growth is substantial and they actually pass those workers by 2012. You can see workers that left the San Francisco MSA and moved to another MSA. That's the 1-6, the green line. They have very strong earnings growth in the new MSA after they leave San Francisco. And then you can see the 1-2 is the purple line. And those are workers that moved up from the 1 to 18,000 bin to the 18 to 54,000 bin. And they had earnings growth as well after the period, not quite as strong as some of the other groups. But this adjacent earnings bin mobility is the most common type of earnings mobility outside of staying in the same bin, which you can see by looking at the pie chart. It's still the mode or the most common outcome, the blue line, workers that stay at the bottom for both years, 2008 and 2009. Here's earnings mobility for bin 2. Patterns are somewhat similar. You can see those workers that actually exit the labor force do better than those that sort of stay or almost catch up to them in this case. You can see the workers that exit, the 2-6 green line, they actually pass the workers that have consistent earnings in between 2008 or in the same earnings bin, 2008 to 2009. And then you see those workers that made a jump up to earnings bin 3, and they have relatively low earnings growth. And so if you were to compare that to the 1s and 2s who actually have substantial earnings growth sort of after the period. And then here's bin 3, somewhat similar patterns. Bin 4, we're getting up to the top earnings classes here as well. You still see this exit from the earnings having relatively exit from the labor market in 2009 having relatively strong earnings effects. Growth for workers in the same earnings bin, their real earnings stay about the same. Actually, workers that move up from 4 to 5, their earnings actually decline in the subsequent years. Here's the very high earning workers. And so workers that, for example, the 5-6, if you compare the green with the 5-5, the high earning workers that leave San Francisco actually take a pay cut. And that's perhaps not surprising. They're probably moving to a lower cost area, but it's a bit different than the results we saw for the lower earning workers. And for the higher earning workers, San Francisco still looks like still seems like a pretty good place to be. And these are the workers that move in. Most of the workers are actually low earning workers, but the earnings for workers that move in at the top of their earnings distribution, that's that purple line at the top from another area, have very high earnings, approximately 250,000 in 2008. They take a bit of a pay cut when they come to San Francisco, but then eventually their earnings catch up and pass their earnings in 2008. Although it takes a long time. It isn't until that big increase from 2011 to 2012 that you sort of begin to see the big payoff from moving. So if we look at these sort of categories here, here in the San Francisco results, we're looking at a specific time period in a specific local area. We can also take a look and see how worker mobility has changed over time for a given metro area. So compared to, for example, 1998, what's the share of workers that are staying in the same bin versus those that are having earnings increases, for example? And this is what we're going to show here. This is New York, and it's year-to-year worker mobility. So are workers staying in the same bin, from 1998 to 1999, 1999 to 2000, and so on. And how does that compare to the mobility that we saw in 1998? And you can see that there's a larger share of workers staying in the same earnings bin over time in the later years than there is in 1998. And that's that red line that's almost continuously increasing over the period. Workers that are having an earnings decrease are a bit elevated during recessions. You can see the bumps in 2001 and 2008, and then they decline post-Great Recession. But they're about 1, but a little below the workers that are receiving earnings increases has actually dropped substantially in New York over the most of the period. It comes back around 2014, but it's still below the share of workers that were receiving earnings, large earnings increases enough to move to a higher earnings bin in 1998. The later years have less workers moving sort of up in the earnings distribution. Here's the levers and movers, relatively close to each other. You can see the share of workers either leaving or moving, coming from another MSA, moving in from another MSA or leaving to another MSA is a bit less over the period, about the same, not a huge difference, a bit more leavers than movers in general. And entrants and exiters is where you can see a really big discrepancy. You can see this difference between entrants and exiters increase during recessions. The exiters are about at the same level they were in 1998, excluding recessions, but entrants have dropped substantially over the period. The share is it's actually always below 1. So there's fewer entrants, new entrants that are going to New York than there was in 1998 for the entire sort of analysis period here after 1998. Okay, so if we're thinking about an interactive web application, and we'd like to add the full set of years, all the metro areas, and also incorporate sort of longer term mobility outcomes. So 3-year earnings averages with perhaps a gap of 5 years, or 2 or 3, have some flexibility there to see how specific workers are doing over a longer time horizon. And then the share graphs, I like them in one sense, but they also don't allow you to do this sort of full decomposition of what's driving the change in the earnings distribution. And if we think back to the results for San Francisco, where the total earnings distribution had changed so dramatically, we'd really want to know, what's going on there, especially for the local area. The welfare impacts of having existing workers moving up the earnings distribution versus those workers exiting and new workers moving in is substantial. And we can answer those types of questions with LEHD data. We've done it in other research, but we want to integrate that with the earnings distribution results so that the user can have a better understanding of why the earning and how the earnings distribution changed from 2 different periods in time. Okay. And then finally, we're going to talk about earnings volatility. And earnings volatility, if you remember that second worker way back on one of the early slides with the sort of green earnings history going up and down, that's volatility. And we're going to measure that by the percentage change in earnings. And then we're going to look at, that's this EIT plus 1 minus EIT. That's our VIT, our volatility measure. And then we're going to look at the standard deviation of these changes, or the spread across all the workers. So do workers tend to have relatively low volatility in the United States, relatively high volatility? And what does it look like? Of course, it's a single measure. It's a single number measure of earnings and earnings volatility in a given year. And anytime you have a single measure, that can potentially mask a lot of heterogeneity underneath. And if you look at earnings volatility, if you look at work histories, most workers have relatively low volatility between 2 adjacent years. So in a given year, about 60 to 70% of the workers are stable. They're active all 4 quarters in both years. So there's no entry-exit from the labor market that causes large earnings changes, and they tend to have the same dominant employer in both years. So there's not a significant job change between the 2 years. And for these workers, they contribute very little to earnings volatility. Most of the earnings volatility is driven by workers at the bottom, and in some sense, that's fine. We use percentage changes here to highlight that. A worker at the bottom of the earnings distribution, for example, that has $5,000 of earnings in 1 year, and it grows to $15,000 in the next year, that's a very large change, even though the $10,000 change in earnings might not be extremely large for someone at the top of the earnings distribution that's making $150,000 a year, for example. But workers at the bottom, these changes in earnings, they're substantial. And if they don't have the ability to sort of smooth their consumption over time by borrowing, then they can face real hardships. And so in some sense, it makes sense to focus on this part of the earnings distribution, but it does mask some other characteristics of volatility as well. And so here's the ARC percent change results for the 4 metro areas. You can see LA has the highest volatility. Perhaps San Francisco is next, then, oh, sorry, did I say so? Yep, San Francisco's next, then Detroit, and then finally the green line in the bottom is New York. Although, as you can see, Detroit actually has a very large decrease in earnings volatility post-Great Recession. And it goes from basically at the very top during the Great Recession all the way to the bottom by 2016. And so there's quite a bit of heterogeneity here in terms of earnings volatility and how it's changed over time. And so to make the point a bit clearer about what I was saying in the difference between low and high earning workers and how they contribute to volatility, this graph shows the absolute value of the ARC percent change for workers moving between different earnings bins. And so, for example, if you move from the top earnings bin to the 1 earnings bin, that's the leftmost blue bar in the graph, that's a potentially large contributor to earnings volatility. It has a high ARC percent change value. But if you look at the red line, which shows the earning volatility share, the actual contribution to earnings volatility is relatively low because those types of transitions just don't happen very often. It's unusual for a worker to move from the highest earnings bin to the lowest earnings bin. And oftentimes that might occur, for example, at the beginning or the end of someone's career, where they have a partial earnings year. But as you move to the right in the graph, you can see the various bin pair combinations and their potential contribution to earnings inequality, and then their actual contribution or the share. And if you get to the 1-1 bin, you see the spike in the red line almost up to 0.3. And that's where the action is. It's at the bottom of the earnings distribution. It's within bin changes in earnings. And this bin's pretty low, so the $1 to $18,000 of earnings. And so if workers in that earnings bin, their earnings are bouncing around a lot, and they contribute almost a third of overall earnings volatility. Okay. And so in the future, what we'd like to do is actually show earnings volatility for workers in different parts of the long-term earnings distribution separately. And so I showed those ARC percent change results, which is for all workers, but some of the interesting results we've done in one of our recent papers actually shows how trends are very different in earnings volatility for workers at different parts of the earnings distribution. And a lot of that is masked because of this sort of dominant component driven by low earnings workers. And so that's one of the things we'd actually like to expand upon. Other authors have used sort of non-parametric measures of volatility. We've looked at that a bit too. We may incorporate those, but they tend to correlate pretty well with the ARC percentage change. And we'd like all of our measures to actually be decomposable so that we can attribute specific contributions to the total to different geographic areas or different demographic groups, for example. Okay, so I've shown you some of the examples of the various types of inequality, mobility, and volatility statistics that can be produced with LEHD data. We've seen substantial heterogeneity across the 4 MSAs. I mean, there's general trends that are similar, but the magnitude of those trends, like the magnitude of the changes in the earnings distributions, for example, differ substantially across various geographic areas. And we've chosen mainly large urban areas. Once we include smaller urban and rural areas, these differences are only going to be larger because, as we saw in the beginning, urban areas tend to be sort of higher earning, potentially lower volatility as well. We'd like to develop an interactive data dissemination system that will allow the user to explore these results and understand changes in the earnings distributions over time and across MSAs. We're actively working on disclosure avoidance methods. And sort of one of the issues like I mentioned before, why we chose these large urban areas is that the sample sizes were large and we could release the results with sort of known disclosure avoidance technology. But now we're actively developing new methods that will allow us to release results for much smaller MSAs across the country. Okay, here's my contact information. If you have any questions, comments, new ideas, whatever, make sure and reach out to me. Also below is sort of related research that John About and I have done on the various topics that we discussed today. So if you want any additional background on sort of why we chose the measures that we did, additional results, here's some of the papers that you can actually download on the web to get more information. So thank you very much. I appreciate having the time to talk today, and I'll look forward to answering any questions. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you so much, Kevin. Before we get to the questions in the Q&A, we received a few questions regarding the presentation and the PowerPoint, which will be accessible on the Census Academy website in a week or two at census.gov/academy under the webinar tab. So we received a question. One of the questions is, are your earnings distributions based on nominal or real earnings? If real, what deflator do you use? Do you use a national deflator or an area-specific deflator?
We've used their real earnings, first of all. We've used two different deflators, the CPI and the PCE. I think the local deflator is a good idea as well. I think it would be interesting to take account of some of the differences, the regional differences, especially in housing, for example, and how that affects earnings inequality. That would probably be a research area at first, but that's an excellent suggestion and something we've thought about as well. So thanks for the question.
Great. Another question is, what is P10/P90?
It's normally P90 over P10, and that would just be the 90th percentile, which would be an earnings value, let's say 150,000, divided by the 10th percentile earnings value, which might be 10,000. And so you'd get 15, and that would be your earnings inequality measure. And
okay.
If the P90 went up, then earnings inequality would go up. If the P10 went down, earnings inequality would go up as well. So it's just one of the standard measures of earnings inequality.
Okay. In the spatial comparisons, have you tried using BEA's local deflators to adjust for differences in the cost of living?
I think I addressed that a bit in one of the previous questions. No, we haven't done that. I think that's a good idea. And we'll definitely put it on our to-do list. Like I said before, I mean, housing costs differ dramatically across MSAs. We are looking at the share of earnings. So the deflators wouldn't necessarily affect the results within an MSA dramatically. But it would affect the earnings numbers and the spread. So, I mean, ideally, it would be great if you had sort of housing costs for different parts of the earnings distribution, so you could adjust those separately. But that data is a little more difficult to come by. So, thanks. Great question.
Another question is, when workers exit, where do they go? School? Unemployment?
That's a good question. So, LHD data does not give an affirmative report of zero earnings or the status when we don't observe a worker. So a worker could go into unemployment. They could go to school, like you said. They could work in a non-covered sector, self-employment. I don't think there's not government in this as well. So they could go to a non-covered sector, and that is an issue, potential issue with LEHD data. I mean, when you're looking at trends, assuming those kind of movements in and out of the labor force are relatively constant over time, then the trends won't be affected too much. But of course, at certain periods, like especially during recessions, for example, those kind of the movements of workers in and out of the labor force change dramatically. When we have complete coverage of all the states, which is why it's especially important. So this sort of period between 2004 and I think 2015, where we have complete coverage at LHD, then you're much less likely to see, for example, workers moving to another MSA that we don't cover. Certainly outside of that range, for some metro areas, that's potentially going to be an issue. Thanks. Another good question.
And we have another, it's not a question, but a comment that I'm really looking forward to the day you can release this for a smaller MSAs. This is really awesome, and I'm so curious to see analysis for my area.
Thanks. Thanks for the comment. I'm excited too. I think there's going to be even dramatically more heterogeneity than we saw for these large MSAs. Although there still was quite a bit just for these 4 urban MSAs. The changes that happened in San Francisco and New York over the period are pretty dramatic in terms of the shift in total earnings. So yeah, I'm really excited as well. If we can work out the disclosure issues, hopefully soon, that we can release data for every MSA that we have in the LAHD system. So thank you.
All right, I am not showing any more questions in the Q&A box, and we're at 2:29. So Kevin, I hand it off to you to say your goodbyes.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the great questions. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Once again, if you have any comments, further questions after looking at the presentation or the talk again, feel free to email me at the address above. And if you're super interested, you can take a look at some of the research papers as well. Thanks a lot. I appreciated the time, the opportunity to talk to everyone.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. And thank you to Kevin McKinney for his fascinating presentation. Also, an evaluation will be mailed to you following this webinar. We would appreciate it if you could take some time to fill out this short survey so we may better serve you. Please join us next month, Wednesday, May 18th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, when Mark White joins us to present Understanding Youth Employment in Missouri. And then until next time, thank you for spending your afternoon with us, and enjoy the rest of your day.